Hello, everyone. We'll begin by reviewing a little bit of what we covered with the last lecture. First, we talked about the Hampton Institute. Now, remember, this is the place that Booker T. Washington attended school, and it was at the Hampton Institute that he met Samuel Armstrong, who became his mentor, and it's where he got the basis for his philosophy of education, even though we have to remember that Booker T. Washington took his philosophy of education beyond what he learned at the Hampton Institute. But the Hampton Institute set the foundation. And at the Hampton Institute, the educational model that Black people were exposed to after the Civil War was a philosophy of education that was one that white philanthropists, white people who funded Black education, it was a philosophy of education that they approved of. And it taught Black people to learn thrift, Christian appreciation, to love manual labor, and to go into the agricultural sciences.
While some Black leaders advocated leaving the South behind, there were other influential voices urging African Americans to resist the siren song of the North and to stay right where they were.
1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success.
Born a slave himself, Booker T. Washington believed that former slaves and their masters shared a common role in the creation of the New South, to help transform it economically. If the South was ever going to leave that antebellum plantation mentality behind, it would require the mutual cooperation of Black people and white people alike.
Booker T. Washington was a very practical man because he was a person who could see the world as it is.
Those of my race who depend on bettering their condition, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are.
He's saying to the Black people, you don't need to leave, you don't need to go north, you can stay here.
As a practical man, Washington argued that political rights for African Americans could only be won from a position of economic strength and self-sufficiency.
He believed that eventually white people would come to realize the value of Black workers.
Cast it down, making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom you are surrounded.
He saw himself as a mediating figure between the white South and the Black South.
The product of a vocational education himself, Washington argued that by learning a trade, African Americans would hold the key to their own advancement. He went on to found the Tuskegee Institute, which trained African Americans in vocational and technical skills and advocated self-help.
So we covered his philosophy last class as well. So again, we're just reviewing. As we know, vocational education for Booker T. Washington was the key to Black economic success. He wanted Black people to become economically essential, indispensable to the country. He believed that Black people should accept social separation and be economically integrated. He wanted Black people to abandon the fight for political equality. And he wanted Black people to allow whites to take the lead in efforts in social progress. The thing he also embraced was that Black people had come out of slavery in need of moral regeneration, moral, ethical education. And that, of course, is one of the things that ignited the fury of some of his um, contemporaries, such as W.B. Du Bois. Anna Julia Cooper is someone we haven't covered yet. And I want to talk about her briefly, but I want to show you a video afterward. So Anna Julia Cooper believed in a well-rounded curriculum, particularly for Black girls. She believed that Black girls needed to be exposed to a curriculum that included math and science. And she was against the kind of vocational education that Booker T. Washington had espoused. She wanted Black people to have college prep education. She was also a supporter of Pan-Africanism. She was a supporter of W.B. Du Bois. And she was an advocate for Black women's rights, primarily through her method of doing public speaking, advocating for the rights of Black women. And she was also the fourth African-American woman in history to earn a PhD. She was a mathematician. She became a school principal as well, the famous M Street School for Girls in Washington, D.C.
It would be subversive of every human interest that the cry of one half the human family be stifled. Woman, in stepping from the pedestal of statue-like inactivity in the domestic shrine and daring to think and move and speak, to undertake to help shape, mold, and direct the thought of her age, is merely completing the circle of the world's vision. Anna Julia Haywood Cooper was born in slavery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Some records say 1858, some records say 1859. She was literate even before it became legal for her to be literate. And as soon as she had access to the resources of St. Augustine, she entered with the first class of students here at the age of 10 years old. St. Augustine's was one of the first educational opportunities for formerly enslaved African Americans, not only in North Carolina, but in the South as well. When Anna Julia Cooper entered St. Augustine's normal school as a 10-year-old, she would have been in the midst of people of all ages, many of them who had not had any exposure to formal education. And so her earliest moments here would have been immediately going into service to the teachers. She would have been, some would have said, the teacher's pet or a teacher's assistant. She was a tutor, and so not only was she learning to read on a higher level, to calculate, to have access to arithmetic on a higher level, but she was actually learning to teach from a very young age. When she realized that she hit a ceiling, being amongst the majority of the student population here at St. Augustine's, she advocated for access to more rigor, to more challenge. And that's when she said, I can do exactly the work that the boys are doing. I can study Greek, I can study Latin, I can study higher level arithmetic, give me the algebra. And so she did successfully advocate for herself. There was some resistance at first. There was this notion that we educate the girls to become homemakers, to become maybe nurses, maybe teachers. She will not need this higher level of education is what the theory was, but she resisted that. She pushed against those thoughts and continued to grow intellectually. And then from here, she launches herself to Oberlin. And there was pretty much a direct route from Raleigh to Oberlin. She is someone who we would call not only a genius, but a lifelong learner. She was in her late 60s when she attained her doctorate degree from the Sorbonne in Paris. As far as we know, she is the first woman of African descent to attain that level of degree from the Sorbonne. She's someone who was relentless in her passion for offering not only to herself access to education, but offering to what the Bible would say, the least of these, access to education. So she was a passionate, lifelong learner, and I think the life of her mind and her spirit was really the heart of her story, the heart of her life. The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity. She is known for an extraordinary piece of writing called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South. It was published in 1892. Her book is really a collection of what appear to be speeches, essays. She moves through reflections on the Civil War, on what she thinks needs to happen for the uplift of African American people. She also commemorates the work of early feminists, particularly New England women and educators. So she really puts into this volume the things that she cherishes and the words that people have called her to share at various moments, particularly at women's rights gatherings. And so it's a wonderful collection of Anna Julia Cooper's thoughts and her philosophy, her ideology. She is calling herself a Black woman, and she's speaking out, lifting her voice and saying, these are the thoughts that I have to share with the world. She's almost saying, I consider myself a brilliant human being, not in an arrogant way, but in a way that resists the notion that women are subservient and African Americans are subservient. She's saying, this is what a woman's mind can create. This is what a Black mind can create. Let our girls feel that we expect something more of them than that they merely look pretty and appear well in society. Not the boys less, but the girls more. This city, Raleigh, bore witness to the birth of Anna Julia Cooper. It bore witness to her earliest attempts at activism, successful attempts at activism. It bore witness to her becoming a very young widow. This city saw Anna Julia Cooper become educated and turn into an educator. This city holds her remains in Raleigh City Cemetery. But certainly, while her story begins and ends in Raleigh and touches Washington, D.C., with the M Street School, the Dunbar School, and touches Wilberforce, and touches Oberlin, Ohio, and touches the Sorbonne in Paris, this is an international story. She's a story of a human voice rising up out of bondage to light a way for others.
W.B. Du Bois we covered in the last lecture as well, but we'll do a bit of a review on him.
Of the leading Black intellectual of the time, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Du Bois earned his first bachelor degree from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and soon became a leader among the emerging African-American intellectual elite.
There's a wonderful image of Du Bois arriving in Paris in top hat and tails, looking like the Edwardian man quintessential. He sees 1900 as a wonderful opportunity to give a counter-narrative to the stereotype view of the African American that has really gone global.
The Paris exhibition embodied Du Bois's philosophy about African American leadership. Unlike his contemporary Booker T. Washington, Du Bois believed that the masses of former slaves in the South, largely uneducated, had little chance of achieving liberation on their own. They needed to be shown the way.
How do we understand how a group of people who are oppressed rise? There's one idea that says you need talented leaders, you need extraordinary, exceptional, educated, the highest leaders, you're great thinkers. That was the talented 10th.
Du Bois was the first African American to earn a doctoral degree from Harvard. He believed it was the responsibility of his intellectual cohort to lead the fight for full citizenship.
Du Bois told Black people that they could not wait to be citizens, that they were already on the books. We have a Constitution. It was signed and sealed in blood during that Civil War and during Reconstruction, and we were already citizens of the United States. You couldn't postpone fighting for justice. For Du Bois, you compromised something too great to wait and to say, one day.
Du Bois waged his battle for justice on several fronts. First, he established the Niagara Movement, whose Declaration of Principles would provide the basis of the modern civil rights movement. And then he co-founded the NAACP, the country's oldest and largest civil rights organization. He also believed that if African Americans were going to achieve equal rights, they had to prove their worth on the cultural front as well, as creators of a unique artistic tradition.
Du Bois was saying that literature can be an agency for profound change. I call it civil rights by copyright.
Du Bois and his colleagues aspired to set in motion a Black literary movement that would compete on the highest levels of New York society.
So we do know that W.B. Du Bois espoused, from our last lecture, that he espoused the talented 10th, but we also know he changed his idea about that. And instead of thinking that the liberation of Black people would come from the leadership of people who had the highest levels of education, he actually started to believe that it would actually need to come from the working class. He advocated, of course, for multidimensional education that included the liberal arts, the social sciences, not just vocational education. He believed that Black people should be proud of their culture, know their history and identity. And he believed that Black people should struggle for social, political, and economic rights and not cede that to the leadership of whites. He was a Pan-Africanist. He called some of the earliest Pan-African conferences. He believed in cooperative economics. Particularly, he espoused this through his study of the Philadelphia Negro, where he really gets into the importance of Black businesses and having an economic plan for Black people. And when he kind of rejected this idea of a talented 10th, his transition to believing that leadership and social advancement would come from the energy of the working class. He called them the guiding 100 who would lead Black people, and that leadership would emerge from the working class. Last lecture, we also talked about how people like W.B. Du Bois joined the national effort to convince Black people, and Black men in particular, to fight in World War I. And it resulted in one economic opportunity. Why? Because so many people had gone and whites had gone to fight in the war that it opened up opportunity in the form of jobs in the war industry, in the metal industry, the weapons manufacturing industry, the jobs that had been abandoned by soldiers who went to fight in the war, resulted in economic opportunity for Black people. It also resulted in economic conflict because there was competition between Black people and poor whites for those jobs. And also, when soldiers came home at the end of that war, they got in conflict with Black people, and Black people were fired from their jobs, and returning veterans were given those jobs. And also, Black people encountered a great deal of racism when they returned, which we discussed before. Ida B. Wells was someone who was educated. She used journalism as a political tool. She was an anti-segregationist and anti-lynching advocate. She used journalism and the court system to fight against racism. She was an advocate for armed self-defense. She believed in Black people's struggle on an international scale. She was a Pan-Africanist. She also advocated, like Anna Julia Cooper, for Black women and Black women's rights. However, Ida B. Wells not only spoke about it, she used writing as a tool for advocating for Black women's rights. Also, she believed in fighting discrimination against Black women teachers. When we talk about the impact of racism after Black people had returned from World War I in 1918, we have to do that in connection to the release of the movie, the film, Birth of a Nation. So this movie, Birth of a Nation, had an impact on public perception. The movie Birth of a Nation was based on Thomas Dixon's novel, which was called Klansman, and it was produced by D.W. Griffith. And it depicted Reconstruction as a national tragedy that unleashed Black beasts on white civilization. The Klan swoops in and saves whites, especially white women, from Black men, Black brutes. That is what was depicted in the film Birth of a Nation. The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. This is the same president who had encouraged Black people to go fight in World War I. But Woodrow Wilson held a screening of Birth of a Nation at the White House and praised it. He called it writing history with lightning. So the movie sparked racial violence at screenings around the country. In fact, the film motivated the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan in the country. And the Klan, it blamed the loose lifestyles among some white women on integration with Blacks and exposure to Black culture. So Birth of a Nation was a film that sparked a lot of racial tension in the country and white terrorism against Black people in the country. We know that 1919, the summer of 19, was known as Red Summer because during that time, hundreds of Black people were lynched and many more were victims of racial terrorism. It's the summer that saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. White terrorism and lynching across the country also had the effect of raising Black racial consciousness. So Black soldiers had returned home from World War I to racial hostility and economic marginalization. And this pronounced inequality, despite African American contributions to the war effort, sparked a new consciousness that became known as the New Negro. We talked last lecture about the riots that it sparked around the country. However, at this time, there was also the emergence of a figure we have yet to address and that figure is Marcus Garvey.
The Birth of a Nation.
D.W. Griffith's birth.
The Birth of a Nation.
D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Released in 1915 to widespread critical acclaim, The Birth of a Nation was picketed by the NAACP for its vicious portrayals of African Americans.
In The Birth of a Nation, major black characters were played by whites in blackface,
Of course.
which made them all the more grotesque. And these black men lusting after white women.
With its searing depiction of black men as sexual predators, The Birth of a Nation helped revive the Ku Klux Klan, which had been largely dormant since Reconstruction. Organized to defend white supremacy, the Klan's membership fluctuated over the decades and tended to peak when competition for jobs triggered violence. On occasion, Klan activities were fueled by resentment of a thriving black middle class, like in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
My grandfather, he has seen a lot in this life, and he shared some of those things with me.
Wes Young was only 4 years old when a single accusation ignited the city of Tulsa.
He told me when he was a little boy that something really bad happened. Told me how he was woken up by his mom, and in the middle of the night we have to go.
Young's family lived in the black section of town, known as Greenwood, where black-owned businesses thrived, creating an oasis at the height of Jim Crow.
In the early parts of the 20th century in Tulsa, African Americans, they said, okay, we have to be separate, and we're going to show that separate but equal is not going to stop us from being successful. We can build our own businesses, we can support our own industry, and in fact, the black dollar circulated 26 times before it left that community, which meant it went from the barbershop to the butcher to the supermarket.
This area was once known as the Negro Wall Street. Prosperous, self-sufficient, all-black world, a model, progress, and achievement. But prosperity for some was a provocation to others. On May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting Sarah Page in an elevator. He was black, she was white. Both were teenagers.
He was working in this building, signing shoes. He had to go upstairs to use the latrine. When he went up there, well, the elevator was packed. They claimed that he patted a white girl on her butt.
In the elevator?
In the elevator, but they never did really prove that he did it because the elevator was crowded and it could have been somebody else, but that's where it started from.
As allegations spread that a black boy had molested a white girl, a white mob headed to the jailhouse where Dick Rowland was being held.
Word had got out back down on Greenwood that they was gonna lynch him. It was a fast-going thing, and they didn't play in them days.
Black men from Greenwood got their guns and protected Dick Rowland from being lynched. But what happened afterward went beyond their control.
A large white mob came over the railroad tracks into the Greenwood community, shooting and burning and looting. There were over 1,250 structures in Greenwood that were destroyed. These were homes and businesses. Because of the fires, the whole area was wiped out. 36 square blocks.
Wiped out in 24 hours.
Really wiped out in less than 24 hours.
My God. Just think of what this would have been today.
This was an effort to stop the success of the community in Greenwood. And there was a message from Tulsa. The message was, if you try to be successful, we're going to bring you down.
The exact number of African Americans killed during the massacre may never be known.
Wow. I mean, till you see it, the enormity of the thing, it's never hit me until right now.
Oh, yeah.
Property damage to Greenwood's homes and businesses was estimated at $2 million. That would be the equivalent of almost $26 million today.
But they didn't burn the spirits.
The Tulsa riots were not an isolated incident. Throughout the country, racial conflicts had been flaring. World War I had just ended. Black and white soldiers were returning home from the front, competing with immigrants for scarce jobs. The mere sight of a black man in uniform could be enough to provoke bloodshed from those who saw his proud assertion of citizenship as a threat. In 1919, an outbreak of violence in Charleston, South Carolina, spread like a virus to some 24 cities. It was known as Red Summer.
And by the time it's over, it is swept north and south and west. Hundreds of people are dead. Cities are smoldering. Young Colonel MacArthur brings the troops in to quell the disturbance. This Red Summer presented a dilemma. We're not making progress. We've left the cotton fields, but it looks like a dead end may confront us.
This racial violence dampened the wartime optimism of many African Americans, causing them to re-examine their relationship to this country, as they had so many times before. For those wondering, where now? A man emerged with an answer.
Fellow citizens of Africa, I greet you in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican immigrant with a keen sense of pageantry and a mesmerizing oratorical voice, appealed to those who saw no future for themselves in mainstream American life.
It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one solid body the 400 million Negroes of the world.
A Pan-Africanist, Garvey believed in the fundamental unity of black people throughout the world.
Garvey emerges at a time when, African Americans are coming back from war, determined to fight and get their rights. He appeals to this sense of black pride in a moment in our history where white supremacy is riding unbound. Mm-hmm. And the response is phenomenal.
At its height, Garvey's organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, was the largest black mass movement in American history.
Garvey becomes one of the era's biggest black nationalist organizers. He is a fan and admirer of Booker T. Washington and thinks that this idea of bootstrap and pulling yourself up is the way to go.
The UNIA started its own businesses, including a printing press that published the widely circulated Negro World newspaper.
Garvey has a messianic vision of himself. He's going to say that black people are worthwhile people. They've been kings and queens in Africa. He wants to repatriate to Africa and establish a colony that's under African-American leadership in Liberia.
Garvey created a shipping company called the Black Star Line to transport those of his followers who wanted to move to Africa. The birth.
So Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica. He was a Pan-Africanist. His father was a descendant of the Jamaican Maroons who formed independent communities. during colonization. He had actually read Booker T. Washington's book while in Jamaica, and he internalized Booker T. Washington's ideas about self-sufficiency of Black people, and he actually wanted to meet Booker T. Washington, although Booker T. Washington had died before Marcus Garvey arrived in the United States. So reading Washington's book, it also convinced Garvey that the situation for Black people was a global situation, that Black people had faced similar circumstances all over the world. However, he had some identifiable differences with Booker T. Washington, especially in terms of politics and equal rights. Garvey criticized Du Bois for what he called his elitism and integrationism. And Garvey criticized Du Bois for not building and for his excessive intellectualizing. They both differed in that Garvey was a global Pan-Africanist who focused on mobilizing the masses of Black people, and he built practical applications like businesses and enterprises, while Du Bois was a continental Pan-Africanist. He was more of a theoretician and was seen by some as an elitist. Although while Garvey's program included returning to Africa, Du Bois felt that Black people should stay in America and support African people's calls for independence and struggles for independence. Garvey criticized Du Bois for calling a Pan-Africanist conference with white people. Garvey saw that as a contradiction. Some people argue, though, that Garvey's popularity had a lot to do with Black people's reaction to post-World War I anti-Black environment. Garvey rejected the idea that his movement was a Back to Africa movement, because he wanted Black people with the willingness and ability to actually make a contribution to African development to return to Africa. He didn't want every single Black person to return to the African continent. So Marcus Garvey's approach rested on four main pillars. One, economics. He felt that Black people should be self-sufficient by having their own businesses, factories, etc. And Garvey felt that Blacks should produce their basic necessities and not continue to be consumers, primarily consumers, instead of independent producers. So he differed from Booker T. Washington. He rejected white membership and especially white philanthropy for the most part, and we'll get to that. Marcus Garvey created a separate economy by creating a newspaper, The Negro World, created grocery stores, clothing stores, restaurants, and laundromats, and he employed over 1,000 people in Harlem alone. Politically, Garvey was a global Pan-Africanist based on the notion of race first and self-sufficiency to meet the needs and interests of all people of African descent. He believed that the primary reason that Black people were being taken advantage of was because they were disunited. He declared that whites had no monopoly on order and government, that Black people needed their own government. He advocated for armed struggle as well to achieve that end, but armed struggle was by no means his primary instrument. It was an option of last resort. In addition, Garvey tried to set up a trade and diplomatic relationships with African governments like Liberia, and it was based on racial cooperation as opposed to communist movement, which Garvey rejected because the situation facing Black people from Garvey's perspective was based on race primarily, not economics. When it comes to religion, Garvey believed that one must see God through their own perspective, their own image. For Garvey, he found religion in the notion of race pride, Black nationalism, and self-reliance for Black people. So for Garvey, power was divinely given by God. He also was a cultural nationalist. In the sense that he felt that it was important to rescue and recover Black history and pride and African identity. Africa to Garvey represented ancestry, heritage, and that people who had once accomplished great things can do them again. Now, the Harlem Renaissance was the emergence of culturally and politically conscious artists. They represented a new sense of racial pride, pride in African ancestry and political consciousness. They expressed a new sense of pride in their heritage. And many Black writers emerged, like Paul Laurence Dunbar and James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the Negro National Anthem. And this is one of the most prolific times in American history, especially for Black writers.
In 1910, Harlem was an upper-middle-class white community. But by 1925, it was known as the Mecca of the new Negro. African Americans came to New York, just as they did to many of the great cities of the North, seeking opportunity. During the First World War, their numbers swelled when labor shortages made better-paying jobs available for migrants. Those who came to Harlem found a place where they were free for the first time to express themselves in ways that seemed inconceivable before.
Many of these people had not been able to pursue their art, had not been able to pursue the opportunity to become a novelist, to become a jazz musician. It simply was not available and possible for them in the restricted caste system that they were consigned to in the South. Suddenly here in New York, finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
It would explode into one of the most artistically fertile periods in African American history.
The Harlem Renaissance represents, above all, Black people really for the first time making a claim on being modern as a people. To say that we are here and this is our contribution.
Here, on 136th Street, in the heart of Harlem, some of the most talented newcomers found a temporary home in a rooming house, which its residents humorously nicknamed Niggerati Manor.
Some of the people that lived there included Eric Walren, the Caribbean novelist and short story writer. Zora Neale Hurston passed through there. Langston Hughes spent time there. They all ended up putting together a kind of salon. It was right here.
Who invented this crazy term, Niggerati?
Zora Neale Hurston playing with the term literati and saying, if they're the literati downtown, we must be the niggerati uptown.
Out of Niggerati Manor came one of the most provocative publications of the Renaissance, a literary journal called Fire.
In that single issue of Fire, the first story in there is Wallace Thurman's Cordelia the Crude. It's about a prostitute, Richard Bruce Nugent's sexually exploratory vignettes, Smoke, Lilies, and Jade. In terms of exploring a kind of queer eroticism, it's one of the stories in the Renaissance, one of the few that does that, that goes there. Harlem came to represent a kind of oasis of permissibility. There were things that could go on in Harlem that could not go on elsewhere.
Harlem's reputation spread throughout the country. Outsiders were drawn to its clubs and cabarets. Races could mingle here in ways that were illegal in much of the rest of the country.
Let's say you get out of the show at Connie's Inn or at the Cotton Club. Something else happens when you can go to the speakeasy after hours and be sitting next to an Ethel Waters or a Duke Ellington.
Were they segregated, these speakeasies?
They were not segregated. You had to know where it was and know how to get in. all of them, you had to know the code. So there was one you would knock 3 times and cough. If you didn't cough right, you weren't going to get in. And if you're thinking about the attraction to a white audience, it's not just the attraction of seeing what was then American popular music, the coolest stuff around. But you also get a kind of proximity and everything that goes along with that, communication, seduction, various kinds of interaction that's not always predictable. You're on top of each other. So that
Literally and figuratively.
Literally and figuratively. You're going to be jammed up with people sweating and drinking and having a good time all night till the next morning. It adds something to the evening.
The Harlem Renaissance spotlighted African-American artists, both as purveyors of cool and as major contributors to American culture. Ironically, the most sublime of these contributions wasn't widely embraced at the time by the black elite. To them, jazz, which had made its way north with many of the Southern migrants, was unsophisticated, even vulgar. But in time, jazz would be recognized as the most quintessentially American art form.
Jazz is significant because it represents some of the best potentials that are inherent in the American conception of democracy. Making sure that everyone has a place to have their own say. And creating out of a fabric of individual contributions a greater whole, a more beautiful whole.
Okay, and this is Claude McKay's poem. Claude McKay was a Harlem Renaissance artist, a poet, and Claude McKay wrote the poem, If We Must Die. Of course, it was inspired by racial tension, the riots, and the sense of self-defense and self-determination that Black people had during the time. It read, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. During this time, Harlem had made the capital, it became the capital of Black America. The new Negro during this time period, Alain Locke was a Black scholar, a writer, and a philosopher. During the Harlem Renaissance, he called this time period the period of the new Negro. For these reasons, there was a cultural side to Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance, and there was a political side. And Garvey contributed tremendously to the political sense of power and self-determination during this time period. Historically, many Black Americans had the expectation that Black artists would produce creative products that are beautiful, but also that they use their art to advance the cause of Black freedom and liberation. And during this time period, the expectation was that a person used their art for free expression, and also to express pride, cultural pride, and self-determination. So the stock market crashed in 1929, and debt was high, unemployment was growing, and prices were way too high. And the Depression made already existing problems in Black communities worse. It also meant that whites would compete with Blacks for menial labor jobs. In Harlem, many Blacks lined up daily to be day laborers. So President Roosevelt is who sparked the New Deal, and that New Deal came in the form of agricultural policies such as the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was always criticized because the Agricultural Adjustment Act was unfairly administered, but it protected farmers by giving them subsidies, by giving them money. And they were basically given money to limit their production to increase the value of the crop. So a lot of money went to Blacks who were cotton farmers, but the program was controlled by white farmers who routinely cheated Black people. There was also the National Industrial Recovery Act, which pumped money into industrial jobs, and many Blacks were in those industrial jobs, so they benefited. But whites simply removed Blacks from those jobs and hired whites as a form of racist retaliation to the policy. And the New Deal economic policies and Roosevelt's appointment of Black leaders into his administration, all of these things caused a shift in Black political allegiance over to the Democratic Party instead of the Republican Party, which Black people had been a part of since the Civil War. At the same time, you had the artistic side that was emerging in the form of jazz. And jazz had developed from a New Orleans ragtime musical ensembles. And we talked about what ragtime was about. But jazz was characterized by improvisation, syncopation, which is the use of the 2/4 meter, and its harmonic complexity and its blues feeling. So jazz actually emerged out of ragtime ensembles. Artists like Jelly Roll Morton were instrumental to the development of jazz. He actually came out of a ragtime band himself. So unlike the AA musical forms, it was more instrumental than vocal. Emphasis was placed on the instrument more so than the voice. Bebop was a particular form of jazz that involved the really faster tempos and larger bands. So people like Charlie Parker came out of the bebop era. One interesting song, if you want to listen to, is Charlie Parker's Coco, K-O-K-O. But it's an example of that bebop style. If you want to take a listen to something like that, I'm sure you can YouTube it. So in a style called free jazz, artists like Miles Davis in the 1970s, they developed a style that was slower and didn't cater to the dancing listeners like previous jazz, more fast-paced jazz. You'll also find scatting as a vocal technique in jazz that used the human voice to imitate musical instruments. Going back to the Roosevelt administration, a key figure was Mary McLeod Bethune.
In Washington's Lincoln Park stands an almost joyous tribute to the great educator and civil rights activist Mary McLeod Bethune. The towering figure, rendered in the distinct style of sculptor Robert Burks, was originally scheduled for dedication in 1963, the 100th anniversary of emancipation. That date came and went, in no small measure because the monument's builders were simultaneously engaged in a very contemporary crusade for civil rights. The 15th child of freed slaves, Mary attended college in hopes of becoming a missionary. In a way, she did, her lifelong mission unfolding in the classroom. For more than 30 years, she presided over a namesake college in Daytona Beach, Florida. During this period, she served as president of the National Association of Colored Women and founder of the National Council of Negro Women. In 1930, she was included on a list of America's 10 greatest women. A valued advisor to several presidents, she was among Eleanor Roosevelt's closest personal friends, and an important force behind the scenes of FDR's New Deal. A larger-than-life Bethune in Lincoln Park carries in her right hand a cane given her by President Roosevelt. With the other, she presents a copy of her famed Last Will and Testament to a young boy and girl, symbolic of work unfinished at the time of her death in 1955. I leave you love, it reads in part. I leave you hope. I leave you a thirst for education. I leave you racial dignity. I leave you a desire to live harmoniously with your fellow men. I leave you, finally, a responsibility to our young people. Formally dedicated on July 10, 1974, the 99th birthday of the woman it commemorates, the Bethune Memorial was the first in the nation's capital to honor.
Okay. So Mary McLeod Bethune believed in education as a means to challenge racial oppression, particularly education for Black females, including economics and industry. She was a strong advocate for women's rights, particularly Black women. She was concerned with urban issues such as equal employment opportunities and quality housing. She was heavily inspired by her Christian background, and she strongly engaged in voter registration for Black people. And she believed that Black people suffered and fought for freedom and liberty that have yet to be enjoyed in the country. Mary McLeod Bethune was the key to the impact that the New Deal had on Black communities. She was the person who oversaw that New Deal policies were equitably applied. And she is yet to get the full credit for the work that she did, particularly in the New Deal. She led it. She pressured the president to adopt colorblind policies. And she was the head of the Federal Council on Negro Affairs, which was known as the Black Cabinet, of course. A. Philip Randolph was a major figure during the same time period, only he operated outside of the government. He emerged as an economic and political race leader for Black America during and after the World War I. So in 1917, A. Philip Randolph and a person named Chandler Owen, they started something called The Messenger, which was a socialist journal. That same year, he organized a union of elevator workers in New York. In 1925, he became the president and the general organizer of what was known as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the first African-American-led labor union to negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions. So Randolph's efforts were complemented by other Black people in politics, particularly Oscar DePriest, who became known as the first Black person elected to the House of Representatives. And he introduced 3 anti-discrimination bills, one against discrimination in Roosevelt's New Deal employment initiatives, an anti-lynching bill intended to make lynching a federal crime, and another to allow jurisdictions to be changed if defiant, and if, especially if they couldn't get a fair trial due to their race or religion. So in 1936, Randolph became the first president of the National Negro Congress, and he made effective political use of the mass march as a strategy. A. Philip Randolph is very key because his introduction of the mass march as a strategy as early as the 1930s ended up being used during the Civil Rights Movement to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as well. And his mass march strategy continues to be used by African Americans as a political tool today. But it's important to remember where it came from. So the pressure that he placed through organizing his mass march in 1941 sent 10,000 Blacks to the national capital to advocate for equal opportunity in employment and a protest against discrimination in the defense industry. So the pressure of this organized march led Franklin Delano Roosevelt to pass an executive order creating what was known as the Fair Employment Practices Committee. So in response, Randolph called off that march, yet he tried to keep the movement going. And he constantly defended his philosophy of keeping the movement aggressively all Black. According to Randolph, this was done out of pro-Blackness and not anti-whiteness. More importantly, it was to protect the movement from philosophical infiltration. So the Nation of Islam was founded July 4th, 1930 in Detroit, Michigan by Wallace D. Fard Muhammad. The main religious thrust of the Nation of Islam was influenced by Christianity and Muslim. But the Nation of Islam asserted that Christianity was used as a tool to oppress Black people. Not that its nature was oppressive, but it was used as a tool to oppress Black people. That Black people were a chosen people from God, whose mission it was to bring about justice. And it was necessary for Black people to separate from whites so that they could be self-sufficient and that they could have autonomy. And it also stressed racial and Islamic solidarity throughout the world. They brought together both racial pride and religious pride. So what the Nation of Islam was able to accomplish was they broke the white racial monopoly on God. And they broke the Arab monopoly on Islam. That God didn't have to be white, and you didn't have to be Arab to be Islam, to be a Muslim. And it established a historically specific, culturally specific form of Islam among Black people.